With hindsight being 2020, I'm going to say something controversial. A suggestion so heinous that it'll cause riots and brawls. Brother will fight brother and families will be ripped apart. I mean, if you're a nerd at least. The prequels aren't nearly as bad as the sequels. Given to Disney, it would prove that a soulless corporation taking over a beloved franchise would make it into probably the most boring husk of a trilogy ever. That may be inflammatory statement out of the way. Why are prequels and sequels so often bad? Why does it seem to be so hard to give us more of a good thing? Why is it always so complicated? Let's talk about that today on Why Are You Talking About This? Nerd. Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of Waytat Nerd. I am your host, William, and I will be your guide today through the funky, fucky world of the past and future, and while never amount to how things are right now. And sure, you can read into that if you want, but I didn't. Anyways, I want to thank you so much for listening. It means the world to me to have my voice blasting through your eardrums and incepting my ideas into your brain. Yes, this is a psyop. You've been warned. But before you think about that, I don't really have much in the way of updates. I more just want to gauge some thoughts on some stuff and let you guys know what the future of my shows will be. So I've been wanting to turn my career towards content creation for a very long time, and I do not want to stop doing these podcasts. In fact, I'll always probably be doing them on some level, but is other stuff I want to do. And I've thought about talking about Warhammer since that's something I know about, and the community is generally pretty welcoming amongst content creators. So I've been thinking about doing stuff in that space, but, let me know if that's an interest for y'all. And on the podcast future side of things, I'm not going to cut back again, but I think I'm going to loosen it up a bit. To be honest with you, I run myself pretty hard and ragged and stress myself out to get episodes out. And it's not really feasible to be that hard on myself, especially when I'm at this level. And it also does make episode quality generally worse. And, I feel like it comes out in my voice a bit. So I'm going to be less stringent about posting times and exact dates. I am still planning on taking that break. I think it's going to be as soon as episode 40 comes out. I'm probably going to take a couple months off, just to relax. I've gone quite a while on the show without having a break. I think at this point it would have been like 30 episodes because I took a break after episode 10, and that was only like an extra week. So, yeah, I mean, you can still expect about every 3 weeks with Waytat after Wednesday and Nerd after Friday, but I'm not going to wreck myself for it. Then once things pick back up, I'll devote more time to the shows. Also, in case anything gets weird and funky with the audio, at least as far as like hearing things in the background goes. So where I live, we are expecting thunder and lightning, and of course, I am recording probably daring it. We're not getting hit with the most of it, but because I have a new precious little boy, little kitten at home. He is going to be in the recording with me, and he's actually in my arms right now. So if he wakes up and gets all wily and rambunctious, you're probably going to hear him. You might also hear some thunder in the background. So, yeah, just be forgiving of that, and we got some shit going on here. So, yeah, on to the show. All right. So today we will be talking about prequels and sequels, a style of storytelling that's extremely common these days, but also seem to be lower and lower quality. So let's talk about why that is and what these are. So a prequel is a narrative released after an existing story consisting of events that take place beforehand. While a sequel is a narrative that continues the story of the previous work after it ends. Pretty simple, right? Well, you would think so, but they both have some pitfalls. For prequels, the biggest issue you're going to run into is that the fate of everything is already predetermined. There's a pretty hard ceiling of, the original story. So you can't do something too unexpected or end the story in a way that will require another story with even stricter confines to explain how you went from one ending to another. Like, for example, if the original story begins with the King of Demons being sealed away and threatening to break out, you can't have your 10 years ago prequel end with the King of Demons on the doorstep of winning. That obviously doesn't make any fucking sense and kind of skips the most interesting part. And this obviously reduces the tension, so you need to make your story not reliant on surprise or that tension of not knowing what happens next. Secondly, a lot of your character arcs will become either redundant or meaningless, because by the end of the story, they need to be exactly how they were at the beginning of the original. I mean, assuming that they're the same people. Although this also includes character deaths. Prequels will almost always have the versions of characters that the audience hates or got over, or the version of the character that's fucking dead, because this is before they had the character growth, or the character decay, which is a massive problem in prequels. Like, for example, if your character in the prequels is the moody, pissy crybaby in the main story, you either have to kind of make them a moody, pissy crybaby in the sequel, or turn them into one throughout the story. Either one your audience will hate. Same with making them dead. Also, a lot of the elements of the setting will be missing. A lot of the tech invented during the current time will be missing, or your core elements are going to be completely gone or undone. A lot of the tech invented during the current time will be missing or can't have happened yet. The main threats and allies may be massively different, and some of your core elements are going to be either gone or just entirely undone. Which, sure, could be interesting, but that's hard work, which is a problem for a lot of people doing a prequel. Your plot is also constrained by whatever backstory you told in your main story. Meaning, if you have something substantially big here, your audience will wonder why it wasn't in the original. And sometimes the backstory is too sad, crushing, difficult, or, even boring to be worth telling. Sometimes backstory is just backstory. And finally, a lot of people love the canon, so if you fuck around and screw up the canon or change it retroactively because Lamau, fuck you, then you're setting your audience into hater mode right out of the gates, which is not where you want them. Sequels, meanwhile, have a massive pressure on them to perform. Fucking up a sequel more than a prequel ruins the entire series. Because if a prequel is fucked up, yes, the shadow of it's still going to be there, but you can bury it and try to pretend it never happened. In fact, a lot of people do. Or you can add more onto it to contextualize it and make it less egregious. Or, hell, do what happens to some series and entirely rewrite the prequel. Sequels, on the other hand, kind of close down the future trajectory of a story. And any story built on top of a sequel will have to contend with it. What can ruin the series, and oftentimes, which can ruin a series, and oftentimes a bad sequel does. It's also hard to have anything interesting enough to keep up with what your audience expects from it. They've been hyping it up since who knows when, and it's almost always going to be better than what they really get. Relatedly, it's also hard to keep your story consistent, but keeping it fresh and interesting. Combining these things together, how the fuck do you go from defeating the corrupt emperor in charge of the majority of the world and usurping them? How do you deal with your audience has been excited about 10 million different conflicting aspects of what your sequel could be, while trying to write your part 2 to your 3-part tragedy about becoming the monsters you once fought? And finally, you're kind of bound by loose ends. Whatever loose ends there still are at the end of your first story, you either need to account for them or explicitly kick it down the road to the next sequel, which will inevitably deal with the loose ends from this story, and so on until you go insane or the series dies and you release a series of comics or a compendium of short stories tying up all these loose ends directly. But, okay, that sounds like a lot of shit to deal with. So, why do people do these? Well, besides the, editing, William, can you insert the Mr. Krabs "I like money" sound here? Huh? Oh, no. Fuck off. For prequels, it's usually for the love of the game or to stroke the audience's love of the setting. It helps to build a backstory for existing stories and retroactively build lore and the lead-ups to the events of the main story. And they also expand the world building and bolster not only the universe, but can reinforce the point of your main story. Like what you were trying to say in the first place. And it also serves to develop your characters and their origins, especially villains, and makes them into redeemable, explainable, sad, or fuckable. Sometimes all of those, and some people just want their genitals to combine with a villain that's inexcusably evil all the way down, and this lets you show them that too. Oh. Oh. Sorry, when I just had a kitten fart on me. Oh. And for sequels, the reasons for it are pretty similar. But more of the focus is on harnessing the fanboy sweat to make it a success. So your audience investment is already high, so the success is a lot easier if the first work was well liked. And if you've already hit the bullseye, you don't really need to do anything near the amount of work to be successful. At least from a numbers and money standpoint. And since a lot of people want the story to keep going, sequels are not only a cash cow, but a great way to farm investment and demand because they want to see characters they like do things. That being said, be careful. Because there's some diminishing returns. I mean, look at Marvel, for example. Leading up to Endgame, I watched all the Marvel movies and loved them. After, I started to give less and less of a shit, which seems to be the consensus among a lot of the audience. But every success that you have brings in new people that want to get on board with something cool as hell that keeps somehow fucking juggling all of this. And finally, you get to keep your world and characters, people and places you're familiar with, and rich lives to delve into. So you can keep telling their story. So overall, prequels are good because they're safe and can be interesting for insights, but are very, very confined and aren't going to interest anyone who isn't already in your world. Sequels, meanwhile, are good because you can capitalize on your success to write something that'll more easily get success and also be easier to write, but you'll need to keep this juggling act to try and hit expectations over and over to keep the story going well. So with that, let's go over to the history section. The cat flipped over. Alright, so we began once again with the ancient Greeks. And while they didn't use the terminology of prequel and sequel, they did have stories that fit into it. Like the lost poem Cypria, which preceded the Iliad, would have fit into the definition of a prequel, while the Odyssey fits into sequel territory. But we don't actually see a lot of prequels and sequels in the ancient world. Not because people weren't writing them, but because the history of literature is constantly getting spit roasted by two different dicks of inconvenience. The first is that all of this is old as shit. So, of course, we're going to lose a lot of stories. In fact, there's probably thousands and thousands of prequels and sequels, but these stories are kind of just gone forever. And the other is that people back then didn't have nearly as much of an interest in keeping permanent, unchangeable record as we do today. Yes, there was an interest in that, and a lot of the records that we have are because people were interested in that, but for the most part, most people preferred to live on in story or the hearts of their family or as legend, either eventually being forgotten or mythologized. While today, a lot of people want to, or their family want to, permanently be put in the annals of history with an undeniable and permanent mark on reality that is as close to honest or what their intentions are as possible. Meaning, if someone wrote a sequel, they probably wrote it on clay, stone, paper, papyrus, hide, or they did it from memory. None of which really survives very well for thousands of years. I mean, also the literary world at the time didn't necessarily have the culture or structure to really have a bunch of prequels and sequels, since the idea of fiction as we know it today didn't really exist. I mean, a lot of it was like folklore mythology. But we do have evidence from the late 17th and early 18th century when we have the beginnings of intentional sequels as they happen today. In the late 1600s, the Romantic and novella traditions begin to develop into their modern forms. And if you know these art forms, yes, sequelitis is a major concern. But in the 18th century, with easy access to printing and the literature market developing rapidly, a lot of an author's ability to survive as a writer didn't become based on producing something their patron could lord over all their friends with as being the best fucking thing on the planet, but instead based on the copies that they could sell. Meaning that more and more started to produce sequels to maintain their standing or increase it. And it also quickly became a way to maintain copyright, since at the time these laws were still being formed, and a publisher could claim your work unless you produce more works in a particular style to build the case that it was your stuff. So the easiest thing to do to address all of this? Sequels. And by the mid-18th century, sequels became firmly rooted in the culture of writing, and authors started to maintain and grow their readership by drawing their audiences in and retaining them with a lot of them. And it also served to establish strong IP and kill fanon that they didn't like by writing sequels that directly fought IP bandits and fanon. Also, to some extent, to alienate readers they didn't want reading their books, because yes, it's the 1700s, so racism and sexism is in season. And this remains the general culture until in 1904, L. Frank Baum publishes The Marvelous Land of Oz, a book published largely by popular demand rather than authorial authority. Then, in 1958, the first use of the term prequel appeared in print, in an article by Anthony Boucher about the book They Shall Have Stars by James Blish, a prequel to Earthman Come Home. However, the 50s was kind of a surge of popularity for the prequel, with authors like C.S. Lewis writing The Magician's Nephew and R.F. Delderfield writing The Adventures of Ben Gunn. And by the 70s and 80s, prequel entered common language, including when in 1977, after being pressed on the Silmarillion, which is essentially the setting Bible for Lord of the Rings, and what its purpose was and how it related to Lord of the Rings and The Hobbit, Christopher Tolkien said that his father coined the term prequel and that the Silmarillion was that to the Lord of the Rings. Though the combination of there not really being much evidence and him essentially pressed into saying it. I'm not going to claim that that's right. Prequels were introduced to mainstream audiences, and not just nerds, in 1979, with the movie Early Days being a prequel to Butch and Sundance. In the late 20th century, prequels became used often with the introduction of the Star Wars prequels. In the 21st century, with the rise of gaming and its subsequent corporatization, video games started getting more and more expensive to produce. Added to that, the player base for most games braying for more content and constant updates. A lot of developers on both the indie and AAA side started to embrace the comfort of prequels and sequels rather than developing new games. And the movie industry began operating the same way until eventually we get to today. Which, since we aren't covering the current, we'll mention briefly here. Basically, leading up through the 2010s and 2020s, sequels and prequels have reached a heartless and empty zone again, like they did in the mid 2000s. This is unfortunately largely on the shoulders of Marvel, as they demonstrated that extended universes can work to corporations, which has since caused content bloat, where many companies push sequels and prequels to create these vast interconnected universes, rather than telling good stories, because they learned the lesson early and copied the wrong part of it. Instead of focusing on what people liked, like storytelling. So, let's talk about how you can do that for yourself and avoid the same mistakes. Alright, so let's get to the actual advice. And like other episodes, I'm mostly going to use the advice of others. That's because I'm a hack. No, it's mostly because I don't have a lot of experience writing these, and even when I do write them, it's usually pretty far in the past or future, so not super relevant. So we're going to start with the prequel advice. First, from Rainy of the Dark. They suggest that when you write your prequel, make sure you check through your original story to see if there's space for it. Like unexplained events, hints at old stories, and remember wins. Because these will not only be likely questions your audience still has, but also give you a way to subtly slip it in rather than fucking ham-fisting your story in there. It's a lot like it's a lot like doing anal. You don't just like ram it in. You need to like be a little subtle about it. Subtle's not the right word. Subtle. you need to not be. You need to not be forceful about it. You can't just like ham fist. You gotta be, controlled, calm, whatever. Second, make sure to add appropriate cameos. Readers love to see familiar faces, so don't forget that if you have that 1,000-year-old elf character that you're doing anal on, you can bring them in during the prequel. A lot of people will like this as long as you use a timeline and the events line up to what your audience expects. Third, add a twist that won't impact the outcome of the story. Even though it's hard in prequels, having a surprise or a twist can hit even harder because it's almost entirely unexpected, because your audience thinks they know what's happening and what's going to happen. Like, say, your story is following the parents of your characters. You just don't know which ones match their kids. Well, maybe the super goody two-shoes paladin character gets together with the Force Witch, and everyone's kind of expecting that your nature god worshipping character in the first story is their kid. But surprise, surprise, their relationship falls apart before they can get married. And that kid came from the turbo atheist wizard couple. In the right context, that'd be a hell of a twist, especially if there's some kind of birthright curse going on. Fourth, star a character from the main story or someone they know closely, but make them an almost entirely different person. And finally, make sure that the story is worth it. It's tempting, sure, to just write side stories about your favorite characters, but remember, you have a story you're trying to tell, not just smush your fucking action figures together. So things need to thing, and people need to people. You have to add something to the world instead of just playing with your toys. For Zara Chowdhury, the beginning is the same. Know your story's foundation. Make sure you understand and respect the universe you're expanding on, and go deep on unresolved and said but not shown narratives, characters, and events. Secondly, prequels give you a golden opportunity to breathe new life into characters that had small parts. Show them off as more of a person. Third, use the chance to expand your world. While your original main story may be locked in one place, your prequel can be anywhere in the world. So delve into what the world was like before your story happened, but with a little bit of balance of the familiar so your audience understands how things relate. Fourth, maintain the tension by avoiding known outcomes. Sure, your audience knows the Demon King is locked away, so they know this story's ending. So instead, introduce a new conflict mystery. Work in the vague spaces and make them specific. So, like, if, sure, the Demon King will lose at the end of the story, introduce a new conflict in the form of people that the main characters want to protect. Maybe there's a city that's in his sights that isn't mentioned in the main story, or there's just a vague, yeah, he really fucked up some places hardcore before we stopped him. Then your audience is suddenly interested again. Not because of the main conflict, but because they're worried about these side characters. Or they want them to die, depending on how good your writing is. Fifth, make sure you honor the original. Well, yes, make a story that stands on its own merits. You should still reference the original, have connective tissue between them, and hell, maybe even flip-flop who's a major or minor character. Maybe the main character in your original is a side character that they brought along, Wolf and Cub style. Sixth, be consistent and mind continuity. If it happened in the present story, it's canon. Don't subvert the canon in the prequel and pay close attention to detail. Keep tone, style, and narrative all cohesive, which should be easy if you're writing about your own world. But even if you're making a movie from another director's work, maybe watch their movies and tone match. And finally, don't be afraid to challenge people and offer fresh perspectives. Your audience may know the outcome, may know what to expect from a prequel, but don't be afraid to bend the rules a little. Sure, they expect it'll be, well, here's how this shit show happened. But maybe instead it's a prequel about that one time where they were all sitting around a fire talking about their previous adventures, and someone said, hey, remember that time in Argula? And everyone groans and tells them to shut up. Okay, and then we have Orin from Mythcreants, and I fucking love Mythcreants. Seriously, check them out, and they're great. That is spelled Mythcreants. So like the others, the first advice is to preserve the original material. Your audience likes the original, which is why they're here. So keep this story fitting into it smoothly. Keep the drama personal, because stories from the olden days or the past tend to get mythologized and lose some of their meaning and specifics, meaning that you can shift the plotline away from concrete issues and shift them to personal conflict with fewer issues to the combined plotline. And again, subvert expectations. Your audience will assume what the story is about, and so shift the focus a little bit. Fourth, make sure to resolve unanswered questions your audience has. Rather than focusing on the backstory of your main characters, focus on the things that your audience really wants to know about and doesn't have much information on, or that they thought was cool. Like the magic system, old history, or a particularly weird mythological character. And so now we go to sequels. Nisha Tooley has two big pieces of advice for writing your sequel. So first things first, like with a prequel, go through and read the original. Look through and note things down for your sequel. Cool and interesting stuff, things that haven't been resolved, how your character progression has gone and where they're going, and what exactly is coming up for them to deal with. And second, establish connections between the two stories. And yes, sure, it's a necessity, but it's something a lot of corporate writers seem to forget. Instead of overdoing it and basically copying the first story but restating like you're stealing it from Wikipedia, instead make sure the story's unique while maintaining some form of connection, like a returning cast or important places or major events. Brent Hartringer adds to this. So, firstly, don't just pick up where you left off. Make an original story. Your last story's plot has already been resolved, so give your audience a new thing to think about. Which relates to the second. Give your audience a new thing rather than a bigger thing. Make the entire story's feel, look, and flow different rather than just turning up to 11 and giving them a reskin of the same events. Even though that's tempting, and you'll probably get pressure to do that. Third, change the stakes. Your readers aren't going to be fooled and will be entirely turned off by having the same story again. So instead, give them something entirely new with a new message. Fourth, play with their expectations. If something happens one way in the first book, show that that isn't always how it has to work. Assuming that's within the rules of your world, of course. Don't go changing the rules of magic or breaking physics. If someone makes a wild assumption, have them proved wrong. Or double subvert and have them proved right. Either way. Fifth, expand your cast. Not by too much. Well, it's not even necessarily expanding your cast with the next point. Just introduce some new people. Give your audience fresh faces to be attached to. Sixth, don't be afraid to have characters leave the cast, either by dying or just going off somewhere else. But make sure, if you do this, that you use them as much as you need, or it works for their character to do this. And finally, give people more of what they want. Look at your previous stories and what people liked, and bring those back. Alright, and there you are. So, get out there and start writing. Let's go. Yes, I know. No soapbox. I'm sorry. But look, we're already late. And besides, I don't know how controversial I can get on this topic. That the prequels are good and you're just salty about Jar Jar? Anyways, don't forget to subscribe to this podcast feed, like it, leave a review, whatever else it is you can do on your platform of choice. Send me an email at waytatpods@gmail.com. That's waytatpods@gmail.com. With questions, concerns, opinions, compliments, insults, your favorite quells, why I'm dumb and wrong, and anything else you want to tell me. Also, follow me on Twitter at waytat_pods. Remember to check out my other podcast, Waytat, where I talk about topics that are usually a bit deeper. Alright, have a good night, have fun, keep writing, and remember, look out for Waytat 2, Electric Boogaloo, out next Friday. This has been Why Are You Talking About This Nerd? I've been your host, William. Good night.